Hello and welcome to the Paranormal Experience with me, Paddy. For those who heard me an hour ago, I'm back. Yes, we relaunching the Paranormal Experience. As I said, Dave, as I said in the Facebook post should I say, Dave can't be with us all the time, but when he can, he will be. For all those new listeners to the Paranormal Experience, I'll just take you through what the Paranormal Experience is. Every week we'll be discussing the paranormal, meaning anything that's unexplained, whether that be, UFOs, ghosts, goblins, cryptozoology, the likes of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, Abominable Snowman. Now for years I thought they were all the same thing and they just had different names for them, but no, they're all different. We talk about cryptozoology, and the gorilla was actually a cryptozoologist thing in Europe many years ago, because somebody had been across to Africa, saw a gorilla, came back, explained it to people from Europe who had never ever seen a gorilla, and it was then put down exactly the same as a Yeti, a Bigfoot, in the fact of it didn't exist. And it wasn't until obviously we eventually started to see them appearing in zoos, etc., that we accepted that the gorilla was actually a real animal. But it started off as cryptozoology. So does that mean Loch Ness may one day become real? Well, just have to wait and find out. But it's all about entertainment. The Paranormal Experience is an entertaining show. We're here to entertain you, the listener. We're discussing, as I said, we'll be discussing lots of different stories. I've got a few lined up for you tonight. But we're not here to debunk anything. It's an opinion. If I say something, then it's my opinion. It's not fact. Well, it might be based on fact, but what I mean is it's not the be all and end all. Just because I say it doesn't exist doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just I haven't seen proof. Because there's 5 types of people in this world. There's the believers who believe, everything's paranormal. They see something in a photograph or a video and it's paranormal. Then you've got the non-believers who won't accept that what it is, it's definitely not. Then the third type of people, which is what Dave is that he's a believer, but he looks logically at whatever first. I've seen him see photographs and say where people have said it's a paranormal thing, and he's said it isn't. And Dave's an expert as far as the photography is concerned. So he tends to look at that sort of stuff. And then you've got the non-believers like myself, who have a very big interest in the paranormal, hence the reason of the show. I read lots of books, watch lots of TV programs, investigate lots of stories. As I say, I've got a few stories coming up. And but I don't believe because there's been no definitive proof. Doesn't mean that the paranormal doesn't exist. It just means that I don't believe that the paranormal exists because there's been no definitive proof. But I have an open mind in the fact of if that definitive proof comes forward, then I'll be willing to hold up my hands and go, yeah, you're absolutely right, the paranormal exists. Then you have the 5th person, and this is the person that has no respect for anybody. Whatever anybody says to me, I'll respect. If they say they've seen a ghost, then they've seen a ghost and I'll accept that. I'll not believe that they've seen a ghost, but I will accept that they believe they've seen a ghost. But you've got the people who just have no respect for people, and whether you're a believer, whether you're a non-believer, they come from both sides, because you've got people who are believers who will, have a go at you because you say, oh, well, it could be this. Dave actually experienced that with a photograph. He said what he believed it was it was a video, sorry, not a photograph. He said what he believed to be a cat in the video, and he got hordes of abuse from believers. There were private messaging him on Facebook because he did have an opinion that wasn't what they wanted to hear. And also you've got the non-believers who, you know, will call people idiots because they believe in the paranormal. But you get none of that on this show. As I say, Dave's a believer, I'm a non-believer, but we respect each other's opinions, and that's why the show works so well. Sometimes, don't get me wrong, sometimes we have arguments, or heated debates, should I say, where we decide that, you know, and there's been times when I've actually been the one that's been defending the paranormal, so it is quite a strange thing. But yeah, so that's what the paranormal is. It's an opinion-based program. So therefore, it's not me saying ghosts don't exist. It's me saying, but it could possibly be this instead. Now, if you walk away from this show and you think, yeah, Paddy's possibly right, then fair enough. But if you walk away from this show and go, no, Paddy's definitely wrong, then also fair enough. Because as I said, it's an opinion. Now, in my lifetime, I've experienced 3 incidents that believers have told me are paranormal experiences. I, however, do not believe them to be paranormal experiences. I believe them to be dreams, my subconscious. Basically, the first one was I saw a vision standing in the doorway of my bedroom one night. And that particular night, my brother-in-law passed away. Now, I know some of you who believe in the paranormal are instantly going, yeah, that vision was him coming to tell you. But it turns out that the vision that when I eventually described it to my sister, who was married to the brother-in-law who passed away, she said that was her. So the question is, why did she come and visit me when he passed away? Why didn't he come and visit me? You know, if you're going down the paranormal route. Because she's still very much alive to this day. So why would she come and visit me to tell me of his passing? That's something, you know, that obviously is yet to be answered. And, well, it never will, because it was many, many years ago. So obviously the incident's well gone. So we'll never know. But as I said, I put it down to, because he was in hospital, he was poorly, so was my subconscious thinking that could happen. The second time was that I had a dream that I was going to inform my 2 sisters about the passing of our mother. And I went to hospital. It was my turn to visit her when she was in hospital, and I went to hospital with my my fiance at the time. We ran a bit late. We missed the bus, so we got the next bus. And we went into the hospital, and the blinds on the cubicle where my mother was were drawn. So, you know, doctors come and visit people and they draw the curtains, so that's all I thought it was. So I'd actually jokingly said, as we were walking up the hill past the ward, because where the room my mother was, the window was actually next to the hill, and I jokingly said to my fiancée that I'll bang on the window, you know, and she was obviously, don't be stupid, you know, and I didn't. But anyway, to carry on with the story, so the curtains were closed, so I approached the nurse and I said, oh, is the doctor's in seeing Mrs. McGough? And they said, who are you? So I obviously told them I was her son or whatever. And they then took me into a room. Now you see it on TVs and films all the time, where as soon as somebody goes, you know, we need to talk to you, or, you know, come here, you see them, like, you know, break into tears and fall to the floor on the knees and whatever. I can tell you that didn't happen at all with me. I was stuck in a room, I didn't have a clue what they were doing. They sat me down, still didn't have a clue. And even when they said the words that my mother had passed away, it took that split second for it to register. It wasn't even like an instant registration of what words the nurse was saying. It took time. I mean, I'm not talking, 20 seconds. I am literally talking a split second. But it took time for the brain to register that she was telling me that my mother had passed away. And I then had to ring my sisters to inform them of our mother's passing. So that's the second time. The third time is a bit more recent, and it only happened last year. And it was my ex-father-in-law. I mean, going back to the thing about my mother as well, about how, I think it's a dream rather than anything else. Now, she wasn't in the situation where we thought she'd pass away. She had been, because there was a time she was in hospital where she'd received the last rites, and we pretty much thought that was it. But she hadn't. She'd come out of hospital and whatever. And obviously I had to, so was it playing on my mind that she was back in hospital, and I was thinking back to that time, so subconsciously was my mind telling me, or what? I don't know, but yeah, that was the dream that I had to inform my two sisters, and as Sonia's and Diane have said in the chat room there, it's a phone call, of course, that Diane and I will never forget, and Diane said, very true. And it was, it was, it's not probably, it was the hardest phone call. I'd actually managed to pull myself round, and it wasn't until I spoke to them and then I heard them break down that I then broke down again. So I was back to where I was. But anyway, the third time, as I say, happened more recently, and it was my ex-father-in-law. And I had a dream, and this time it was him that come to visit me. He never said anything, he just appeared in my dream. Then obviously I found out the next day that he'd passed away. Now the thing about that is we had been informed earlier on in the week that he wouldn't last the week, and he sadly didn't. I mean, he was a great man. It was a sad loss to the world. But that's the three paranormal experiences, if you want to call them that I've had over my time. And as I say, I put them all down to subconscious because of things that were happening at the time, or just dreams and whatever, my mind playing up and what have you. So that's, I could be wrong, and this is exactly what I'm saying. That's my opinion, that these were not paranormal experiences, but they could well have been paranormal experiences. So it's one of those where I'll have an opinion of what I think, but that doesn't mean I'm right. So anyway, so that's my paranormal experiences. For those who didn't listen to the last version of the paranormal experience, Sonia, my sister, had a very interesting story to tell us about how she'd gone to Scotland with her daughter, and they stayed in for want of a better word, a monkey cottage. Well, I'm saying stayed. They didn't stay long in this monkey cottage, and then they returned home. However, and I'm sure she'll keep me right here, she kept experience every time she turned on her sat-nav in her car, the route was coming up to take her back to this cottage. Now, some people have said objects can't be haunted, so therefore it had to be either Sonia or her daughter who was possessed. But then I've heard others say that inanimate objects can be possessed, so therefore it could have been the sat-nav. Now, again, I'm not saying that it's not paranormal, because it could well be. I'm not an electronics expert, but you do have glitches in, you know, in cookies when you go onto websites and stuff like that. Because there was also an incident where she went onto the web and the page for booking for that cottage came up, even though she had no intention of going back to this cottage. It came up on the web. So, like I say, you've got the cookies, you've got glitches and things like that. So there is things that, and apparently 8 months later, because she's just put in the chat room. If you're listening, get in the chat room, because that's where it's all happening. That's where we can chat better to you. Something I haven't mentioned to those that are listening on the radio. We are live streaming to Facebook as well. So if you want to ask me a question on Facebook, then please do. Or if you want to come and listen to us in the on the radio station, then, and you're on Facebook, then get yourself across to www.ambronradio.com. Come in the chat, and obviously you can let me know. But as I said, Sonia said in the chat room, to this day, 8 months later, she's still receiving the route to go back up to Scotland. So 8 months after the event, it's still happening. She said she will record a video of her deleting the location. Because she says, would it not be easy just to go back? Yeah, sometimes it might be. Because that's the other thing. Why is it asking you to go back? Is it because there is something paranormal about it, and they try to entice you back? Or is it that the sat-nav has been haunted, possessed by a spirit, and it wants to go back? You know, because that's also an option, isn't it? It could be it's woke up in Stanley and gone, whoa, I don't know, I don't want to be in Stanley. You know, because I wake up in Stanley all the time and think that. But no, it could be that it's woke up in Stanley and realised it's, Toto, this isn't Kansas anymore, and it wants to go home. So it's trying to get Sonia to take it back. Or is it just a glitch, a cookie, whatever? That's the sort of thing that we like to discuss. We like to hear stories like that. We like to hear about things where, the paranormal could have happened. And as I said, we're not about debunking, so it's got nothing to do with you telling me a story and me saying, no, that couldn't have happened because of. I'll give you an opinion, and I'll give you a possible of how that's happened, but that doesn't mean I'm right. It's just a possibility that that's happened. So that's obviously something that I'll obviously discuss. But as I say, we've got plenty of stories, etc., to get through. We've also got, for those who've never heard them before, we've also got a couple of cabinet curiosities. There was a gentleman by the name of Aaron Mankey who does a podcast. Well, he does a few podcasts actually, but he does two that are really, really interesting. One's called Lore, L-O-R-E, and we actually play that on a Monday night. We play 2 lore stories on a Monday night, from 11 till 12. So if you're into folklore, then please listen to that. But he's also got Cabinet of Curiosities. Now, Cabinet of Curiosities are a bit shorter. They tend to only be 3-4 minute stories. Because we're restarting, for those who listened in the past, we will be starting from scratch. So tonight you'll hear story 1 and 2 from the Cabinet of Curiosities. As I say, it's, if you've heard it before, then you've heard it before. But obviously we'll be progressing over the weeks. Something else that we're going to be doing over the weeks, and this is the reason why I'm live streaming to Facebook at the moment. There's 3 things. The first one is we're going to launch the Paranormal Experience as a podcast. So some of the stories that I discuss will be put on podcast. Obviously, if you come on and you tell me a story and you don't want it to go on a podcast, then just tell me that, and obviously I won't put it on. So obviously it's on Facebook for that. The other reason is to get used to streaming, because as I said, we will be live streaming from certain areas. Areas that are reputed to be haunted, we will be live streaming from. And also the other thing is, I want to eventually put all these stories into a book and release them as the Paranormal Experience. So, the more stories I get, the easier it will be to fill me book. But yeah, there will be a book, a podcast, and obviously the live streaming from the different locations. We're having a look around to see what areas we're going to go to. Christine says Sonia's gone. I hope she's decided to go to Scotland now. And Diane says, but if it's an old ghost, how does it work with sat-nav? Well, that's the thing. Is it a ghost? Is it a spirit? Is it a glitch? Is it whatever? But it could be just in the system, and it could have found the route that Sonia had originally put in, and and keep, every time Sonia deletes it, keep going, no, you can't delete that. So that's the Paranormal Experience. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I do putting it together, because I have thoroughly enjoyed putting the Paranormal Experience together. Looking up stories and discovering things. What also makes me laugh about the Paranormal Experience is some of the things people have said. And we'll come across two of my favourite people. Tonight we'll actually mention two of my favourite people, because we're going to be talking about the Amytiville Horror story. The reason we're going to talk about that is because Defio, who committed the crime, died in March of this year. So we're going to speak about the Amytiville Horror. And the reason I'm mentioning the Amytiville Horror and the two of my favourite people is because I have two interviews. One from 1976, when they supposedly investigated the house. And then one from 1989. Now, I'll not go into too much detail, but let's just say there's a slight difference between the two. So that'll be discussed later on. We've also got the story of Mary Roff. Now, there's some stories which are very, very difficult to debunk, or I use the word debunk because that tends to be the word that paranormal investigators use when somebody uses something to disprove a story. I don't want to disprove a story, but we will use the word debunk just so everybody is on the same wavelength. And as I say, the Mary Roff story is quite a strange one, and one that's, even for the most ardent non-believer, difficult to debunk. So we've got the Amytiville Horror story coming up, we've got the Mary Roff story coming up, we've also got a story of a gentleman whose phone rang after he was dead. When I say rang, I mean make calls, not it rang, because obviously, but actually, and I'll not go too much into it because obviously we'll hear the story. But his phone actually called home after he'd already passed away. So that's another story for us to discuss, and obviously we'll see what else we come across as we go through the different stories. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to, go down the route of what we did in the past. For those who've never listened to the Paranormal Experience before, we sort of lost track of the paranormal, and we were sort of, if you go onto Facebook or YouTube, Amber on Radio on Facebook, or as I say on YouTube, and type in Amber on Radio, you'll see our first shows, which were very good, very, very interesting. A couple of discussions with Dave and I. But then we sort of lost track of the paranormal when COVID came along, and we started to get a bit political and a bit COVID stuff and this, that, and the other. So we're not going to do that. It's going to be purely paranormal. So the stories will be based on paranormal stories, whether they're real, whether they're not. That's up to you to decide. When you walk away from the show tonight, it's up to you to decide whether it's real or not. I can tell you how them stories were debunked or how them stories have turned out, but that doesn't mean that it's true. So that's obviously what we're going to be doing tonight. So, because obviously I want to get these Cabinet of Curiosities in, I'm going to take a break. And I'm going to play you your first Cabinet of Curiosity, which is actually called Calculated Discovery. Then after that, I'm going to come back and I'm going to tell you the story of the Amytiville Horror. So stay tuned and I'll see you shortly.
Our world is full of the unexplainable. And if history is an open book, all of these amazing tales are right there on display, just waiting for us to explore. Welcome to the Cabinet of Curiosities. It was just a simple advertisement, and for a game, no less. There was absolutely nothing illegal or dangerous about it. And yet, here they were, sitting across the table from a pair of FBI agents. The product in question was a pretty simple dice game, and with the Christmas season approaching, the company had decided to run a few ads in the biggest city in America, all of them scattered throughout one single issue of The New Yorker. All of them were small and square, sort of like an Instagram post, and each one told interested buyers to refer to the main advertisement on page 86. The game had been created by a company called Monarch Publishing, and the ad had been written by one of their executives, a man named Roger Paul Craig. He and his wife had spent hours trying to craft the text of the main ad, which touched on the approaching holiday season and all of the things people might have to do to be ready. The trouble wasn't in the text, though. It was in the artwork. At the bottom of the large ad on page 86 was the big, bold title of the game, The Deadly Double. Beneath it was an emblem of a bird with outstretched wings, 4 talons, and 2 heads. It's what's known as an armorial device, a sort of coat of arms used for identifying individuals and groups. This particular symbol was the spitting image of the double eagle used by the Byzantine Empire, Ivan the Terrible, and, more recently, Nazi Germany. Add in the fact that the title of the ad included the German word Achtung, which means danger, and it was a curious pairing for sure. And that's probably what drew the attention of the investigators, but it certainly wasn't the only thing they were worried about. The bigger problem, it seems, was inside each of the smaller ads. Each of those were identical, and they showed a pair of dice in action. It's hand-drawn and has a classy tone, but the items in the ad are a bit more mysterious. One of the die showed 3 sides, revealing 3 distinct numbers, 12, 24, and the Roman numeral 20. The other die showed the reader 5, 0, and 7. So as Roger Paul Craig and his wife sat across the table from the FBI agents, they were starting to get nervous. The numbers, according to the investigators, were significant, and that wasn't a good thing. 20, they said, was awfully close to the latitude line where Pearl Harbor sat. The 12 and 7 looked a lot like December 7th, the date of that infamous attack, and the 05 could very well have been 0500 hours, the original planned start time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. But so what? It wasn't illegal to place historical details in an advertisement. Yes, it would be in poor taste, sure. Over 2,400 lives were lost in the Battle of Pearl Harbor, so it's probably not the best subject matter for a dice game looking for gangbuster Christmas sales. But the trouble wasn't the subject matter. It was the timing. You see, the ad that Monarch Publishing placed in the New Yorker was published in November, on the 22nd, in fact. November of 1941. 16 days before Pearl Harbor was attacked. It's easy to take computers for granted these days. They do so much for us. They allow us to break barriers and create new forms of art and expression, and take selfies with birds flying around our heads. Important stuff, clearly, but they haven't always been so small. Take the Apollo guidance computer. It was built by MIT and used by NASA in 1969 for their Apollo 11 mission, and that's the one that put the first humans on the moon. Each one weighed 50 pounds and was the size of a piece of carry-on luggage, but they worked. We landed people on the freaking moon, after all. As crazy as it might sound, though, the mobile phone in your pocket is more powerful than that NASA computer. 32,000 times faster, in fact. You see, computers have a tendency to get smaller and more powerful over time. Go back far enough, and some of the earliest electrical computers were massive and slow. ENIAC is a great example. It filled up an entire room, but in 1946, it was a supercomputer. There's another old computer worth mentioning, though. It's not electrical, but by definition, computers are nothing more than machines that can be programmed to carry out specific tasks. Calculators, calendars, counting devices, that sort of thing. Charles Babbage is the big name in that field, thanks to the calculator he built in 1822. It was all gears and levers, but it did its job nicely. And so did this other one. Like a lot of old computers, it's not in the best of shape today. But when it was brand spanking new, it focused on astronomy. Want to know when the next eclipse was going to be? This computer would tell you. The lunar cycle? You're covered. People could even program it to track the time between special, regular occurring social events. It was brilliant. But here's where it gets weird. This computer is older than Babbage's 1822 device, and yet it's smaller than NASA's Apollo guidance computers, which seems to fly in the face of how useful and advanced it really was for the time. You see, this computer wasn't crafted in the workshop of an English mechanic or in an MIT lab. It was built so long ago that we forgot about it in the first place. But in 1900, some men found it and handed it over to people who might know what to do with such a powerful device. Those men were sponge divers. They found the computer underwater, just off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera, and it hadn't been there since the 1800s or even the 1700s. According to the archaeologists who have studied it over the course of the past century, this computer is much older. It was built over 2,000 years ago.
So there we go, there's Aaron Monkey and his Cabinet of Curiosities, and that's called Calculator Discovery. Obviously you had the old calculator from 2,000 years ago, and then the first story, which was about the game, which turned out to predict the Pearl Harbor bombings. Very, very strange. So anyway, we'll move swiftly on, and as I mentioned, Richard DeFeo was the guy who murdered his family. Now I thought I actually had the page up, but it appears I don't, because I was going to tell you the Amytiville Horror story, but for some reason I haven't got the actual thing up. But never mind, because obviously I'm an idiot. So anyway, the Amytiville Horror is a book by American author J. Anson, and it was published in September 1977. Remember these dates. So on November the 13th, 1974, Ronald Defoe, or Defeo, I always thought it was Defoe, but it's D-E-F-E-O, so it's Defeo, but I always thought for some reason it was Defoe. Ronald Defoe Jr. shot and killed 6 members of his family at 112 Ocean Avenue, which is a large Dutch colonial house situated in the suburban neighbourhood in Amityville on the south shore of Long Island, New York. He was convicted of second-degree murder in November 1975 and sentenced to 6 sentences of 25 years to life in prison. Defeo would go on to die in custody, as I mentioned, in March of this year. Now, in December of 1975, so, just over a year, George and Kathy Lutz and their 3 children moved into the house. But only 28 days later, the Lutz family were to flee from the house, claiming that they were being terrorised by paranormal phenomena while living there. So the book is based on a true story. Now, I always remember watching the film Amytiville Horror, and I always remember my mother, who wasn't a, she was as sceptic as they come, and I always remember her telling me that it was based on a true story. Now, because my mother said it was based on a true story, then obviously it was more believable that it was based on a true story. So I sat and watched this film. Maybe I shouldn't have done, because if it came out, in 1979, then I was only 12-year-old. So I had to watch it when I was about 13 and 14, so maybe I shouldn't have done. But I remember being scared because my mother said it was a true story. So it was based on a true story, and it describes a house at 112 Ocean Avenue as remaining empty for 13 months after the murders. George and Kathleen Lutz bought the house for what was considered to be a bargain. They paid $80,000 for it. Now, in what world is $80,000 in 1975 a bargain? But having said that, it was a 5-bedroom house. It had a distinctive gable roof. It also had a swimming pool and a boathouse. Oh, well, there we go then. It was located on a canal. George and Kathy married in July 1975 and each had their own homes, but they wanted, obviously, to start afresh with new property. So this was basically their first family home. So they moved in December 1975, and much of the Defeo's family furniture was actually still in the house because it was included for £400 as part of the house sale. So they paid £80,000 for the house, but $80,000 should I say, and $400 of that was actually to buy some of the furniture. Obviously not the beds, but some of the furniture. A friend of George Lutz learned about the history of the house and insisted on having it blessed. George was a non-practicing Methodist and had no experience of what this would entail. Kathy, who was a non-practicing Catholic, explained the process. George knew a Catholic priest named Father Ray who agreed to carry out the blessing. In the book, he's the real-life priest, Father Roff J. Pecora, is referred to as Father Mancuso for privacy reasons. So Father Mancuso was a lawyer and a judge at a Catholic court and a psychotherapist. He lived at the local Sacred Heart Rectory. He arrived to perform the blessing while George and Kathy were unpacking their belongings on the afternoon of December the 18th, 1975. He went in the building to carry out the rites. When he flicked the holy water and began to pray, he heard a masculine voice demand that he get out. When leaving the house, Father Mancuso did not mention this incident to either George or Kathy, and on the December the 24th, Christmas Eve, 1975, Father Macusa called George Lutz and advised him to stay out of the second floor room where he had heard the mystery voice. This was the former bedroom of Mark and John Matthew Defoe, the two younger brothers of Ronald. Kathy planned to use it as a throne room, but the call was cut short by static. Following his visit to the house, the father allegedly developed a high fever and had blisters on his hands, similar to stigmata. At first, Kathy and George experienced nothing unusual in the house. Talking about their experience, subsequently they reported that it was as if each living in a different house. So they obviously were telling different stories of the actual events. After getting in touch with the father, the Lutz decided to take some belongings and stay at Kathy's house in nearby Deer Park, New York, until they had sorted out the problems with the house. They claimed that the phenomena followed them there, however, with the final scene of Anson's book describing greenish black slime coming up the staircase towards them. On January the 14th, 1976, George and Kathy Lutz, with their 3 children and their dog Harry, left 112 Ocean Avenue, leaving all of their possessions behind. The next day, a mover arrived to remove the possessions to send to the Lutzes, who reported no paranormal phenomena whilst in the house. So, some of the Amytiville story has faced criticism over time. The role of Father Pecora in the story has been given considerable attention. During the course of a lawsuit surrounding the case in the late 1970s, the father stated in an affidavit that his only contact with the Lutzes concerning the matter had been by telephone. Other accounts say Father Pecora did visit the house but experienced nothing unusual. So did he or didn't he? The claims of physical damage to the locks, doors and windows were rejected by Jim and Barbara Cromarty, who bought the house for $55,000. So the Lutzes lost $25,000. They bought it in March 1977. March Cromarty argued that they appeared to be the original items and had not been repaired. The Cromartys also revealed that the Red Room was a small closet in the basement and would have been known to the previous owners of the house because it was not concealed in any way. The claim made in Chapter 11 of the book that the house was built on a site where the local Shinnecock Indians had once abandoned the mentally ill and dying was rejected by all Native American leaders in the area. The claim of cloven hoof prints in the snow on January the 1st, 1976 was rejected by other researchers, and neighbours reported nothing unusual during that time when the Lutzes were living there. Police officers are depicted visiting the house in the book and in the 1979 film, but all police records show that at no point were the police ever called whilst the Lutzes were living there. And there never was a bar in Amytiville called the Witch's Brew. Critics include Stephen Kaplan have pointed out that changes were made in the book as it was reprinted in different editions. In the original hardcover edition, the priest's car is an old tan Ford, and he experienced an incident with the hood flies up against the windscreen whilst he's driving. However, the father drove a Chevrolet Vega, and the bonnet, or the hood as they would call it, actually doesn't open that way. It opens away from the car, so it flips. So the opening is actually at the windscreen and flips towards the front of the car. In order for the hood to come up and smash the windscreen, it would have to have been severed from its hinges and come up that way, which, if that happened, it would actually just fly over the top of the car and wouldn't actually hit the car at all. Also, in May 1977, George and Kathy Lutz filed a lawsuit against William Webber, who was the defence lawyer for Ronald Defoe at his trial. Paul Hoffman, who was also a writer working on account of the hauntings, and Bernard Burton and Frederick Morse, both alleged clairvoyants who had examined the house, along with the Good Housekeeping magazine, the New York Sunday News, and Hearst Corporation. The Lusters alleged misappropriation of names for trade purposes, invasion of privacy, and mental distress. The claims against the news corporations were dropped, and the remainder of the lawsuits was heard by Brooklyn U.S. District Court Judge Jack B. Weinstein. In September 1979, George Weinstein dismissed all of the Lutzers' claims. In September 1979, issues of People's Magazine, William Weber wrote, "I know this book is a hoax. We created this story over many bottles of wine. This refers to a meeting that Weber is said to have had with George and Kathy Lutz, during which they discussed what would later become the outline of Anson's book." Judge Weinstein also expressed concerns about the conduct of William Weber and Bernard Burton relating to the affair, stating, "There is a very serious ethical question when lawyers become literary agents." George Lutz maintained that the Anson books were mostly true. So we've gone from a true story to now being mostly true. In June 1979, George and Kathy Lutz took a polygraph test relating to their experience at the house. The polygraph tests were performed by Chris Gugas and Michael Rice, who at the time were reportedly among the top 5 polygraph experts in America. The results, in Mr. Rice's opinion, however, did not indicate lying. In October 2000, the History Channel broadcast Amytiville, The Haunting and Amytiville Horror Hoax, a 2-part documentary made by horror screenwriter Daniel Farrens. The details about the accuracy of the Amytiville Horror continues. Various owners of the house since the Lutz family left in 1976 have reported not a single problem. James Cromedy, who bought the house in 1977 and lived there with his wife Barbara for the following 10 years, commented, "Nothing weird ever happened except for people coming by because of the book and the movie." So there we go. It's one of those didn't happen, didn't happen. Which brings us to my 2 favourite people, because they made a lot of money from this story. We of course talking about Ed and Lorraine Warren. So here is an interview from them in '76 when they investigated. So the rooms are getting nicer. You seem like a nice, friendly crew. This is them obviously speaking to the interviewers. So what was your first encounter with the Amytiville house back in 1975? Well, it was actually February 1976. We met George Lutz at a pizza parlour some blocks away because the priest involved had told him that if he went back in the house again, the spirit recognition could bring it right back, and that is very accurate. The priest was right. He had also fallen victim to that house, and we were to later meet with him. The house itself, the case, not the house I should say, the case itself has affected our personal lives more than any other case we've ever worked on in 54 years of research. Yeah, more than ever, because the men are an absolute fortune. And that's a lot of places. My husband is a religious demonologist. There's no such thing as a religious demonologist. You can be a self-possessed demonologist. I can now state I'm a demonologist. Doesn't mean I am. But there's no, you can't qualify as a demonologist. There is no qualification. You can't go to college, you can't go to university and get a degree in demonology. There is no recognised qualification. You can sit a diploma course, but a diploma is just something that tells you that you've finished a course. So you can sit a diploma course, which I've actually shared on our Facebook page, the place where you can go to. So my husband is a religious demonologist. My husband is not well. We've been involved with very bad hauntings and very bad diabolical cases. We've even been involved with levitations and blood coming from somebody's eyes. All sorts of bad things. But that case followed us right the way home. Well, the first night we came back from the house, first of all, Ed and I both came under attack. The first time we went in the house, and that's very unusual, and at the time, we were only involved in the research part of it. When we got home, I have to backtrack, sorry. Prior to going in, this is what she's saying, by the way, not me. I have to backtrack, sorry. Prior to going in, the call came about this case. When that call came in, I just had a very odd feeling. I wasn't comfortable. Why was I uncomfortable? I don't have an answer. Why would that case be different than any other case? Yet I felt personally threatened by it, to the extent that I contacted the clergy and asked if they'd go in with in spirit with me. What does that mean? In other words, team up spiritually. No, other than interviews and things like that, that's all that would do. If we took things from the house, this is in answer to a question, did you remove anything from the house? So did you not take things like beds and blankets? God Almighty, they could keep all the beds and blankets. The furniture that was in there was from the Defoe estate. The Lutz actually had their children sleep. So the beds were there. I thought there wouldn't have been, but yeah, the beds were there. The Lutzes actually had their children sleep in the Defoe's bed, just like it is in the movie. It was the same bed that they died in. It just wasn't the same mattress. It was the same frame. However, the Lutzes dispute this in one interview. So what bothered me about the movie was that the good didn't win out over the evil. Usually good always triumphs evil. Alright, let's look at this. This is done on many different levels. First of all, we were there just doing research. When you carry research, you have to know exactly what you're dealing with in these homes, why the evil is there, who invited the evil inside to start with. Ronald Defoe was I'm still finding it difficult to say Defoe, or rather than Defoe. Was a very vulnerable guy, heavy into drugs, occult practices, hated his father. All these are ingredients they're not inviting God into the house. During this interview, obviously, he's still alive, yeah. He'll never see the light of day anywhere in this house to answer your question. Father Pecora came into the house to bless it. That's all he did. He didn't know anything. No research had taken place at the point. He just went in to bless it. He was told to get out. He was slapped across the face. His words to us, my husband and I, was that he was blindsided. He had no idea. Bearing in mind, I've just told you that the only connection with the priest was over a telephone call. That's me joking to death. That's because I'm disrespecting the ones. So what is the most misunderstood interpretation of what you do? So that's a very good question. Maybe that we respect the areas of science, but scientists have never gotten closure on a case. They can measure the point of the object, but we want to go in and bring closure. So we look at the phenomena from a religious standpoint. That is why my husband is a religious demonologist. We're Roman Catholics. Every family we go into is not necessarily Catholic. We have worked with Baptist ministers. We have been beautiful and very helpful. We have worked with rabbis, we've worked with Muslims, we've worked with Anglicans, we've worked with all faiths. The important thing is bringing closure. You can't bring closure unless it's fully documented. That takes a great deal of time. Father Pecora never went into that house to do an exorcism. He met with my husband and I and the Lutz family at Catholic Lutz's home on St. Joseph's Day, and he prayed St. Joseph's prayer for us. I carried a relic for Padre Pio into that home, and in one room in the house, Padre Pio appeared. Yes, he appeared to me in spirit. We didn't know this when we met with Father Pecora, but Father Pecora is the judge of the church. He has a doctorate in our faith. He was a learned man, a very learned man. So he stood to give us the Lord's Prayer. He looked directly at me, and nobody knew about the Padre relic but me. I carried the relic. My husband knew that was about all. But Pecora said to me, "Who do you think brought you out of that house?" I thought I was back in Catholic school. I said, "God, I guess, Father." He said, "Padre Pio, right?" And I said, "How do you know That was my question to him. His answer was, Paddy Pie told me. Yeah. So it goes on pretty much like that, where they're talking about different things. So real quick, can you tell us what spirit or spirits do you think were in the Amytiville house? Evil. Evil, the personification of evil. What was the scariest thing for you? It was when it followed us home the very first night, the evil. It would take me so long to tell you guys everything that happened to our car. We couldn't talk about Amytiville. If you think I was going to talk about it on that flight from the east, you're crazy, and I don't consider myself superstitious by any means. Do you believe that it's still following you around? I think that anything could activate it. It has the wisdom and the cunning of ages. So your faith must be very, very strong in what you were doing. Anyway, we got home. Ed took his briefcase down to his office, which is at the lowest level of our property. The bedrooms are at the highest level. I went to bed. I opened up a brown manila envelope I picked up at the post office, and there was a little book in it. It was all about Paddy Pio. I thought that was interesting. I decided I'd read it to see what it said. Then I realised that two of my dogs, a Belgian sheepdog and a border collie, which were in the room with me, weren't acting right. They were acting like they were drugged or something. They were acting very strange. I tried to read the first passage. When your point of concentration affected, you know that there is some force trying to reach out to you. Has the house been cleared? I've never been back to the house. People are currently living in the house, right? I'm not too sure of that, sir. Is Paddy Pio picture available to look at anywhere? I have one in my room, but it's extremely blurry. And then that was the end of the interview. So that was the interview in 76, 77, when they just had it. This is the interview from 1989. Bearing in mind that in between that interview and this interview, a lot of what I read out before about the debunking had started to happen. So let's see if there's a change in Lorraine's answers, shall we? So the first question is, when we talk about the Amytiville Horror, what specifically are we referring to? Early in the morning of November the 13th, 1974, one of the sons of the Defoe family took a high-powered rifle and killed the other 6 members of the family. That's the Amytiville Horror. That and what followed when George and Kathleen Lutz moved in 13 months after the murders occurred. So the house had stood empty during that time. Yes, local people feared the house. Nobody wanted to buy it. There was a great deal of publicity surrounding the Defoe murders, and the house required a grim reputation. Did some people feel that the Defoe boy had been possessed when he killed his family? Oh yes, most definitely. As I said, there was a great deal of press about the tragedy, and verily the story started about demonic possession. The Lutz didn't care about all this talk. They didn't know about it, not exactly anyway. They were young and good, strong family, and I suppose the story seemed silly to them. So they moved in. Yes, they did. Near Christmas time, neither Ed nor I can testify firsthand to anything that happened in the Lutz house. We have to take J. Anson's word for those events. He wrote the famous book about Amytiville. So the Lutzes had problems in the house. Yes, and almost immediately. How would you characterise these problems? So Lorraine says, well, for one thing, both George and Kathleen experienced what psychologists call personality disintegration. So Ed then comes in with, when you look through many of the cases we've investigated, you see that during the course of demonic possessions, a person begins to change. Fred isn't himself anymore, we hear frequently, or Judy doesn't normally do these type of things. The loved ones of the possessed find it almost impossible to accept these behavioural change. And you say this happened to the Lutz. Ed then says, again, all this is according to J. Anson. Went from a rock-solid hard-working man to a real slob given to volcanic shifts of temper. Was Kathleen Lutz affected? Absolutely, says Lorraine. Normally a very easygoing, pleasant person, she found herself turning angry for no reason, or none that she could see. It was as if something inside her was dictating her behaviour. And things began happening in the house. Well, according to Jay Anson's theory, there seemed to be whatever demonic spirit had troubled the Defoe boy was still loose in the house. So Anson was definitely convinced that the Lutz were dealing with demonic possession. Well, in some respects he was. There could be no other explanation for what Anson claimed had happened. You seem cautious about Jay Anson's interpretation of the case. My sense is that something got traumatized beyond reality. Does this discredit the case? Well, no, not at all, says Ed. Then you think the Amytiville Horror actually took place as Anson suggested? Well, at least his version of the demonic infestation definitely mixes with some of our experiences. In what way? Well, look at the things the Lutzes reported. Hundreds of huge black flies appeared in the upstairs bedroom. The inside of the toilet bowls turned black as if someone had painted them. A large statue moved around the house of its own volition. Windows opened and closed for no apparent reason. Plus both George and Kathleen Lutz told of freezing temperatures that would not abate no matter how high they turned the heat. And then it became sweltering heat that stayed with them no matter how many windows they opened. And you've experienced this with demonic infestation. Oh sure, yeah, psychic cold in particular. All this happened to the Lutzes over a short period of time, didn't it? Well, it's supposed to have happened over the Christmas time. And then they moved. Yeah, then they moved. Things had become pretty bad there. Worse than you've described so far? Well, Kathleen was beginning to have dreams, well, nightmares really, that involved the Defoe family. They were quite vivid and quite disturbing. A crucifix was turned upside down, for example, and that's almost always a sign of demonic possession. And their children will begin to hurt. A boy got his hand crushed, though later there was no physical evidence of this. So we go into a house and we interview the people and they tell us all sorts of things about what's been going on there. But rather than believe their own eyes and ears, they ask us if we think they're insane. Most people in our society are trained to disbelieve in the demonic world. Notice sometimes how many laughs comedians get out of jokes about the demons. Most of us just don't want to deal with the demonic. Emotionally we feel we can't, so we need to discredit it by saying that it's all imaginary. It's easier for most people to think they're going insane than to deal with the possibility of demonic attack. Psychologists call this denial, and we see this all the time. People just can't cope with the unknown. So what was going on with the Lutzes? Well, according to Anson, it was, and when you think about it, it's a natural reaction to stress. You don't want to admit that's really going on, so you come up with a more comfortable explanation. We've moved into a new house where something bad happened a while back and we're just letting our imaginations run away with ourselves. See, no real problem there. Nothing that good old reality can't handle. Anybody notice any difference in the interview there? From the original one where they were adamant that demonic possession had happened to a one only 12 years later, where things started to get debunked, and all of a sudden it's now according to Jay Anson. That's the reason why I don't give the Warrens a lot of credit. They've made a lot of money out of people. Would they make that money if they were around, if they just started out in this day and age? Probably not. Having said that, Zach Bagans has made a lot of money out of the Ghost Adventures. But is it because people want that entertainment, or is it because they believe Zach Bagans? Because he gets debunked, and obviously, you know, he's still made a lot of money from it. So the question is, which do we believe? Do we believe the 1977 interview, or do we believe the 1989 interview? They seem to be doing a lot of backtracking in 1989, didn't they? Compared to what they had in the first place. By the way, if you're interested, that interview, the second interview, comes from a book which I'm now showing on Facebook, but if you're not watching me on Facebook, you wouldn't know. It's called Ghost Hunters by Robert David Chase, and it's the true accounts of the demonologists featured in the film The Conjuring, Ed and Lorraine Warren. It was bought for me by my daughter for Christmas. There is a few others in there as well. There's The Graveyard, The Haunted, A Dark Place, Werewolf, and Satan's Harvest. She bought me them all, because they're all, as I say, Ed and Lorraine Warren. The problem I have, the biggest problem I have with Sonny says Ghost Adventures is a bit of a joke. Yeah, I think probably Ed and Lorraine would have been looked at in the same way that Ghost Adventures is. People, you know, he tends, I mean, I've never watched it, and the reason I've never watched it is because of what people say about it, and I don't think I can actually sit down and watch him, because he seems to, everything's, and Ed and Lorraine are exactly the same, everything seems to be demonic possession. There's some really good stories in there, which I'll go over in the weeks to come. There's some very, very interesting stories, but no, it's all demonic possessions. And as I say, there's an interview by Lorraine in particular in 1977, and then there's an interview with both Lorraine and Ed. Lorraine seems to be the one, what I get, and again, as I mentioned earlier, it's my opinion, what I get from it is Lorraine was more into it than Ed. Ed seemed to, I think Ed's the driving force, as in he's the one that sorts out the money and whatever, but I think Lorraine is the one that's more into the paranormal. She's the believer. Ed is there for the ride to make money. That's my opinion. I could be completely wrong, but that's my opinion. I mean, obviously they're both gone now, and I'm not slagging them off in the sense of the fact that they're both gone now and being disrespectful to them. I'm saying that, you know, they made a lot of money out of stuff they shouldn't have made money out of. I mean, the Conjuring films alone are now worth, well, the whole of the Warren stories are now worth billions of dollars, with the films and what have you. We've discussed in the past, but again, I will discuss it at some point, the Enfield Hauntings, which is Conjuring 2, and I'll tell you about Ed and Lorraine's involvement in that. But yeah, as I say, I'm not here to be disrespectful to Ed and Lorraine Warren, but I do think they made a lot of money at a time when people wanted that thrill. Whereas now people are Ghost Adventures, all those Zach Bagans have wanted to. He makes money. I think it's more the fact of it's the entertainment value now that he makes the money from, rather than him being any good as it was. So yeah, so that's the Amytiville. Being debunked by people saying it was used by the lawyers to. Apparently the spooks have jumped into the show and they've tried playing a song. I don't know. I don't know what happened there. I think the spooks are definitely coming in. Sounding like Michael Jackson's Ben. Well, that's really spooky if it's sounding like Michael Jackson's Ben, because I don't have Michael Jackson's Ben uploaded onto the server. So if it was Michael Jackson's Ben, then I don't know how it came to be getting played. Because it's not. I don't have it. I don't have Michael Jackson's Ben on the upload to the server. So even if the auto DJ was kicking in, it couldn't play Michael Jackson's Ben because I don't have it. In fact, I don't even think I have it downloaded onto my computer, never mind uploaded onto the server. I think that's one of the songs that I haven't got. I mean, I've got thousands of songs on, obviously, because of my shows and whatever, but I don't think I've got. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So, you know, obviously I'm debunking the Amytiville Horror stories here, and then Michael Jackson's Ben comes on, which has no connection at all to the computer, the radio station or anything. So yeah, so there we go. I mean, if you're a regular listener of the Paranormal Experience and you listen to it in the past, you'll know that during one of the shows, my phone jumped off the table. I actually have my phone right in front of me this time. I haven't put it on the table where I used to put it. I've got it sitting right in front of me. It's still sitting in the same place that it was sitting to start off with. So it hasn't jumped, but so anyway, there we go. So that was the Amytiville Horror story, and as I say, it was a story that when I watched the film, I remember seeing the film with my mum, starring James, is it James Brolin? I can't remember the guy who played it. Is it James Brolin who was in the film? And a woman. I'm doing really well here, aren't I? But yeah, but anyway, they've since changed the name of the actual house. It's no longer called 112 Ocean Drive. They've changed the name of it because, as James Brolin, yeah. Thank you, Christine. So yeah, as I can see the woman as well. Morgo Killer as in what do you call her? What do you call her, man? Oh man, Morgo Killer. What's she more famous for? Superman, isn't it? Lois Lane. My brain just obviously gone to mush the night. But yeah, they've changed the name of the Amytiville house. It's no longer 112 Ocean Drive. It's now called something completely different. They've also changed the look of it as well. They've altered the windows, and it's basically because people were driving past, same as the house, because the house they use in the film isn't the house. And both the house they use in the film and the actual house were obviously, you know, being visited by people who were very curious. And it's not good for your neighbours, is it? You know, I mean, there was a murder happened not far away from where I live. In fact, just around the corner. And the last thing I would want is for people to, you know, visitors, tourists, to come into my estate every now and again to visit this house. So yeah, so that's the Amytiville. I mean, it's actually went on, believe it or not, there was actually, because of that story, bearing in mind that incident lasted for less than a month. It lasted for 28 days, right? There has been ironically enough, there has been 28 films. Obviously they're not all based on the same incident. You know, like Amytiville 2 is obviously about another family, and Amytiville 3D. Is that where the flies look like they're coming out? Amytiville 4, The Evil Escapes. Amytiville The Curse. Amytiville, It's About You. Amytiville, A New Generation. Amytiville Dollhouse. Amytiville Horror. That was the remake starring Ryan Reynolds. Melissa George from Home and Away. Am I right? Was it Ryan Reynolds? I think so anyway. It was one of them. So that was remade in 2005. Then you have the Amytiville Horror, you have the Amytiville Asylum, The Conjuring, which is obviously, we've mentioned, based on the story, the Amytiville Death House, the Amytiville Playhouse, the Amytiville Vanishing Point, the Conjuring 2, the Amytiville Legacy, the Amytiville Terror, the Amytiville No Escape, the Amytiville Evil Never Dies, the Amytiville Exorcism, Against the Night, Amytiville The Awakening, Amytiville Mount Misery Road, the Amytiville Murders, the Amytiville Island, Amytiville Vibrator, what? Witches of Amytiville Academy, the Amytiville Harvest, and finally an Amytiville Poltergeist. All based around a story which is reputed to be true. Whether it is or not, we'll never know, because they only stayed there for 28 days and everyone since then has said that they've never experienced anything. So is it true, is it not? I suppose we'll just have to take it on the chin and just, you know, believe it if you want to believe it, but there's so much information out there to say that it's not true. Take it with a pinch of salt. But as I say, if you want to, as I said earlier on, if you want to walk away from this show and believe, then please do, because I am not going to tell you what you can and can't believe. Now, it's 12:30, I'm going to play you another Cabinet of Curiosities, so I've got about 15 minutes, but I'm going to tell you this short story. It's a story of a gentleman's phone who rang his family. So basically on the 12th of September 2008 at 4:22 in California's San Fernando Valley, a commuter train carrying 225 riders collided at a combined speed of 83 miles per hour with a freight train which only had 3 people on board. In what came to be known as the Chatsworth crash, 135 people were injured. 87 of them were taken to hospital, 46 in a critical condition, and 25 of them died there and then. One of the deceased was 49-year-old George E Peck, a customer service agent for Delta Airlines at Salt Lake City International Airport. He had come to Los Angeles for a job interview at Vennum Airport because gaining work in the Golden State would have allowed him to wed his fiancée, Andrea Katz of Westlake Village. The pair had put off getting hitched until they were living in the same state. This would have been his second marriage. Peck had 3 grown children from his previous marriage. His fiancée heard about the crash from the news report on the radio as she was driving to this train station to pick him up. Peck's parents and siblings, who live in Los Angeles area, had joined her. Peck's body was recovered from the wreckage 12 hours after the accident. Yet, for the first 11 hours, his cell phone placed calls to all his loved ones, calling his son, his brother, his stepmother, his sister, his fiancée, and all his various other families. In total, 35 calls were made from his cell phone throughout that long night. When they answered, all they heard was static. When they called back, their calls went straight to voicemail. But the calls gave them hope that the man they loved was still alive. He was just, however, trapped somewhere in the wreckage. So the barrage of calls prompted search crews to trace the whereabouts of the phone through its signal and to once again look through what was left of the first train. The location the calls were coming from, the callers searched and finally found the body of Peck. It was about an hour after all these phone calls had stopped. It was discovered in an autopsy that Charles Peck had actually died on impact. Yet long past his death, his cell phone had continued to reach out to many of those he cared most about, and ultimately led to the rescue to his mortal remains. They, however, according to investigators, never found Peck's phone. But ironically and tragically, it was another cell phone that may have played a pivotal role in the causing of the Chatsworth crash, the deadliest in Metrolink's history. Preliminary investigations reveal that the engineer running the commuter train had failed to heed a red signal light, instead impaling his train onto a single track where the Union Pacific freight train, coming the opposite direction, had been given the right of way. According to teens cooperating with the investigation, they had been exchanging text messages with that engineer as the train left the station, and received a final text message from him just before the collision. Actually, it was 22 seconds before impact, according to the preliminary timeline worked out by National Transport Safety. So therefore, his phone had made 35 calls after he's apparently passed away. Now, the question is, it says according to investigators, his phone was never found. Was it? Did somebody find a phone and stick it in the pocket? You know, oh, this is a good phone. Because back in those days, you couldn't do what you can do nowadays. Back in 2008, you could pick up a phone, take out the SIM card, throw it away, and you'd end up with a phone. So was it a really good phone? And somebody took the SIM card out, so they never found the SIM card. Or was his phone making phone calls? So you say she would want to say goodbye to you, and I think that, if you look at it from the paranormal side, that's exactly what he was doing. Because it was all his family and his loved ones, his son and his brother, his sister, his fiancée. So it was everybody that was close to him that he rang, or that he's supposed to have rang. So, but and then when they've called them back, it's gone to voicemail, because obviously he couldn't answer if he was dead. But there was nothing there. So was he incapable? Because it doesn't actually state what he died from. So it doesn't say whether he was, you know, God forbid, decapitated. Because if he decapitated, you've obviously lost the ability to speak, haven't you? Because you no longer have a mouth. So if he's ringing his loved ones to say goodbye, you know, he's tried ringing, tried to say goodbye, but he can't because he has no mouth to speak with. Or was, you know, his body so wrecked that his voice box had gone, or, you know, his lungs were collapsed or whatever. You know, there's no actual autopsy report. I mean, I suppose if I was to look into it, I'd probably find the autopsy report. But there's lots of reasons why he was unable to speak. So he's rang his loved ones to speak, but then when he's actually, you know, tried speaking to them, he hasn't been able to. Or is it that he did try and speak to people, but was unable to? Like, did he actually physically try? Did he die on impact? Was he still alive? Was he ringing around trying to, you know, say goodbye, as soon as he says, to his loved ones? Or, you know, or even trying to get help, you know? Was he? But he couldn't speak, again, because his lungs were crushed, or, you know, his mouth was broken, so he couldn't speak. It's a very strange one. The problem with either putting it in, yes, it's paranormal, or no, it's not paranormal, is there's so many parameters to the story that it's difficult to say whether it was paranormal or not. There's so many. He could have been alive, he could have tried making a call, somebody could have stole his phone, because as I said, in 2008 it was simply a case of removing the SIM card and putting a fresh SIM card in. So it has, you know, because there'll be people helping, because if you see a train crash, there's lots of people helping. So have they come across the phone? Has the phone been smashed beyond recognition? As I say, there's so many different parameters to the story. You can't really say, yes, that's what happened. No, that's not what didn't happen. So it's a good story. But is it just that? Is it a story? I mean, the first time I heard about it, I was very intrigued because of that, because of the all the parameters that. Because if it is true, because how many times have you been in the house and thought about ringing somebody? I mean, it just happened to me the other day. I actually said to the person, "You must have read my mind," because I was just about to ring you. I actually picked up the phone to ring, and whilst I picked up the phone rang, and it was the person I was just about to call. Is that coincidence? Is it something, something more? These are things that that interest me, and that's why, because there's so many unexplained events that take place that you can't answer by simply going, yeah, this could have happened. Like that Charles Peck story. There's so many things that could have possibly happened that you can't say, yes, it's paranormal. His spirit was trying to call his family. And Sonia's just shared a thing. When I was a boy, I would see scary things in the news. My mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. Absolutely, absolutely. And that was by Fred Rogers. And it's absolutely true. As I say, there is, people often say that the world's become a scary place due to all the things that happen. I don't really want to go too much into it because, like I say, I want to get the last story done, because the last story intrigues me something rotten. It's a really good story. Plus, I obviously want to play the last Cabinet of Curiosity as well. So I don't want to go into it too much. But I actually did, as you know, those that listen to the Paddy McGough show, I recently finished university and I did my dissertation on violent crime and what causes it. And one of the questions that I asked during it was, does crime happen more now than it has in the past? Or, because of social media, do we hear about it more? And the answer, you may be surprised to hear, is that it happens more now than it did. Not because we hear about it more, not because people are getting worse, but because things that weren't crimes have now been made crimes. An example, did you know at the beginning of the 20th century, so just over 100 years ago, we had in this country 10-year-old prostitutes, and it was actually legal to visit those 10-year-old prostitutes. Obviously now we have paedophilia laws, etc. But yes, at the beginning, yeah, moral standards, exactly. Moral standards have gone up, and things have been made crimes that weren't crimes before. Yep. Committing suicide is a phrase that you still hear because it was a crime at one point. There is no such thing as committing suicide now. You end your life, you know, whatever. You don't commit suicide anymore because you can't commit suicide because you're not committing a criminal offence anymore. But that's, so that this whole dissertation that I did, which I absolutely loved doing, it was probably the best bit of the whole course because I got to do what I love doing, and that is looking into true crime. And I absolutely loved it. I had to do a 5,000 word dissertation, and I loved every single minute of it because of the fact that I was looking into violent crimes, and I don't mean I loved it because of the fact that there was that many violent crimes, but I loved it because of the research that I had to do, and this and the other. So it was really good. But yeah, crime happens more now, not because crime happens more now, but because more things have become criminal. Crime has actually gone down in the crimes that existed in the past, but they've gone up. 3 of the stories that I wrote about turned the face of law as far as weaponry concerned. The Hungerford Massacre, the Dunblane Massacre, and the Cumbria Massacre. All 3 have had an impact on gun laws. Now, people often say, yeah, but there was about, I think it was 2012, there was a spike in gun crime. What it actually is the opposite. The spike in gun crime wasn't what people thought. So they thought, you know, Hungerford, Dunblane, and Cumbria. They thought, obviously, that would solve gun crime because of, you know. What you've got to remember is when you talk about gun crime, you're not talking about actual people committing a crime with a gun. You're talking about a crime where a gun is involved. Now, the reason it spiked in 2012 and 2013 was because after the Cumbria Massacre in 2010, there was a massive ban on all guns. Anybody found after that with a gun was committing a gun crime. That's why there was a massive spike. But anyway, we're not talking about my desertion and whatever. We're talking about the paranormal, and I'm going to play you a cabinet of curiosities, and then I'll come back with, like I say, a very, very interesting story. Now, I don't know if you're getting that, but I've just had some squeaking in my ears. Hopefully you aren't getting that. But yeah, I'm going to play you a cabinet of curiosities, and we shall see you shortly.
Our world is full of the unexplainable. And if history is an open book, all of these amazing tales are right there on display, just waiting for us to explore. Welcome to the Cabinet of Curiosities. On November 17th of 1896, the night sky above Sacramento, California was a source of fear and dread. It had already been a miserable night, with the skies filled with dark clouds and a steady wind. But as some of the more observant residents looked up, they were startled to see something else. There were lights in the sky, and they were moving. Now, before you jump straight to assuming this was a UFO, let me give you more of the details. When you hear the whole story, it feels a lot less like an episode of The X-Files, and a lot more like something out of a Jules Verne novel. And we have a man named George Scott to thank for that. He was an assistant to Lewis H. Brown, California's Secretary of State at the time. With access to the Capitol building there in Sacramento, he and a few friends climbed up to the roof for a better look and discovered something more mysterious than lights. According to him, it was a set of 3 lights. They seemed to bob slightly as they moved, almost like a ship on the water. Above the lights, all of the observers could make out the dark shape of something long and curved. Another local claims he heard people up above him where the lights were, calling out orders for guiding the vessel. He said he could make out the full shape of the object above the lights, calling it a cigar-shaped balloon with wheels at the side like a steamboat. But let's step back for a moment and let that soak in. This man was claiming to see a paddle wheel boat in the sky over his community. More than unlikely, this theory seemed practically impossible. For context, hot air balloons had been around for a while. The first aerial photos of Boston were taken by a photographer by the name of James Wallace Black. In 1860, he climbed into the basket of a balloon owned by Samuel King and let it take him over 1,000 feet into the sky above the city, where he took his photos. It was a new use for a technology that had been around since the 1780s. No one, though, had managed to find a way to power and control those flights. Remember, the reported hot air balloon steamboat contraption thing over Sacramento happened in 1896, a whole 7 years prior to the first recorded powered flight by the Wright brothers. So if the reports were true, and this was a powered flight, it could rewrite the history books. Over the months that followed, the unidentified aircraft was seen hundreds of times. For a while, it seemed to stick to the Pacific coast, flying down to San Francisco before heading north to Washington state. It vanished again for a while before reappearing near Omaha, Nebraska in February of 1897, which seems to have been part of a larger journey eastward. On April 11th, witnesses reported that the airship had finally reached Chicago. There's an old photo of it online, like a dark cigar against the pale white cloudy sky, but most historians think it's fake. Still, people saw it, and just like in Sacramento, they wondered what it could be. Even though later reports claimed the mysterious airship had crashed, rumors about it continued to fly all over the country for some time. No pun intended, I swear. Whatever it was, we may never know. In a culture that was deeply in love with the idea of Jules Verne's Captain Nemo, who sailed the oceans in a highly advanced submarine, anything was possible. And it spoke to the deep hunger most people have for answers to the mysteries of this world that we call home. If anything, perhaps the story should serve as a lesson to all of us today. Keep your eyes on the sky. You never know what you might be missing. The model was meant to be a glider. The committee was certain of that. They were a collection of aeronautical engineers and experts in flight, so for them to look at the small wooden model and see its potential was a huge relief. There are certain elements that help an airplane fly through the air, and this model glider seemed to have nailed all of them. The wings had that perfect curve built into them for generating lift, what engineers refer to as the cambering. Those wings also bent downward toward the tips, another key element of aeronautical design. And the shape of the entire model craft was exactly what you might expect, a pair of main wings that extended away from the body, and a raised tail fin with two protruding stabilizer wings. The committee could immediately see the usefulness of the design. With a small engine at the rear, they suggested, this glider might be perfect for low-speed flight, maybe even cargo transport. It was brilliant. And that was the problem. You see, this model was brought to the committee in 1961 after having been found in storage where it had been for decades. In fact, it had first been discovered 5 years before the Wright brothers made their historic flight at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. It was a problem because it predated powered flight, something modern men and women have taken a lot of pride in. The box it had been rediscovered in was part of a collection of artifacts removed from a tomb in Saqqara, which had been the burial ground for the ancient Egyptian capital of Memphis, a tomb that had been opened in 1892 and dated back over 2,000 years. And the glider model wasn't a one-off either. Archaeologists had found over a dozen others just like it, all of which are brilliantly designed for powered flight. We tend to view history as a never-ending slope upward, where each new century places us farther up the technological ladder. We believe we're always gaining altitude, climbing to new heights, and soaring over our ancestors. It turns out, we might be wrong. In the end, our pride might be nothing more than a flight of fancy.
So there we go. Iron Monkey and his cabinet of curiosities. Like I say, if you want to sit down and listen to a podcast, listen to both Lore and Cabinet of Curiosities, there's also another one, not by Iron Monkey, but another good one called Weird Darkness, which discusses things like the paranormal, etc. But I wanted to finish off with this story. The reason I wanted to finish off with this story is because, as I said, a lot of the time, a non-believer like myself who looks for an answer can normally find one. However, this story leaves me intrigued. Mary Roff was born in 1847, and she was only 6 months old when she first started to suffer from seizures. Her parents were obviously very worried, as they appeared to be epileptic seizures, and left poor little Mary unconscious for days at a time. She however made a recovery, and although still suffered the seizure, every now and then she began living a normal life. The family decided to move, and they moved to a place called South Middleport, which is in Indiana and Texas. This was when Mary was about 10 years old, and they built a house there, but Mary's seizures continued. This was, of course, before anti-epileptic drugs were developed, so the parents could do nothing but just watch and keep Mary comfortable during her times. They did, however, try bloodletting, which is where somebody would cut the victim and allow blood to let, hence the name. Now, a profession that actually specialised in bloodletting, believe it or not, was barbershops. And that's the reason why, even to this day, some of them have red and white poles outside of their shops to show red for the blood and white for bandages. However, Mary didn't like this idea, and she preferred leeches. So rather than being cut, they would put leeches on her. The strange thing happened with Mary in the fact that she started to treat the leeches like pets, just like a child would stroke a kitten, and that's how she did with the leeches. This treatment carried on for about 3 years. And then when she turned 18 in 1864, she took to bloodletting herself. This is where she would take a knife and cut herself. In fact, she used to do it so badly at times that she'd pass out from the lack of blood. But then she'd spend days sometimes just thrashing around on her bed screaming, and on several occasions multiple adults had to hold her down to prevent her from harming herself. Then it all went calm. Mary just lay there awake but unresponsive. People would come into her room, but she just didn't acknowledge them. But when not in this state, she didn't require assistance from anyone and carried on with her life as normal. She would get up, get dressed, make herself food and do that. But her parents noticed something odd, and that was she was actually carrying out these normal day routine. Although her eyes were open, she never actually used them. She would do things without looking. So they tested this by taking stuff that she'd wrote or stuff they'd wrote, and they'd blindfold her, and then they would shuffle this stuff behind the backs, and Mary every time picked out the thing that she needed to pick out. So whether it was a letter or whatever, she always picked the correct hand. She never failed to get it right. So to test this even further, someone, a neighbour, brought an unopened letter, and she told them who would sign the letter. Bearing in mind, nobody had opened this letter. This letter had arrived at this person's house, and it was brought straight to Mary, who, after just feeling it, told them exactly who had signed it. And when the envelope was opened, she was right. It was that person. She was still, however, suffering from seizures, and obviously she was starting to suffer with depression because of them. And then sadly, on July the 5th, 1865, her parents left her home alone while they went on a short trip. Mary got up that day, made herself some breakfast, and then went back to her room. She, however, suffered the most powerful seizure that she'd ever had, and she never recovered from it. She died as a result of this at the age of 19 years old. A year before the tragic death of Mary, Thomas and Lucinda Vennum welcomed to their family a daughter who they named, ironically enough, Mary Lurancy Vennum. And the family instantly started to use her middle name for some reason. So when Lurancy, as she was now more commonly known, was just 7-year-old, her family moved to South Middleport. But since Mary Roff's death, the town now had a new name. It was now called Watseka. Everything was just like a normal child's grown up, but then at the age of 13, Lurancy started to say she could hear voices in her bedroom calling her name over and over again. Her parents just put it down to an overactive childhood and just ignored it. However, on the 5th of July, 1877, Lurancy suffered a seizure which left her conscious but rigid for 5 days. When she snapped out of it, she told her parents that, 5 hours, 5 days? Well, when she snapped out of it, she told her parents that she felt very strange. But of course her parents just chalked it down to her experience of having a 5-hour seizure. She suffered another seizure the following day and was once again awake, but as stiff as a board. This time, however, she was able to speak to her parents, and she was able to describe what she could see. What she was seeing was not the interior of her bedroom, but in actual fact, it was the interior of heaven. The parents knew this because she described how she met her 2 siblings who had passed away years before at a very young age. She was only 3 when her brother had died, but she could describe him and everything around him. From then onwards, Lurancy suffered seizures right up until about the 27th of November of that particular year, 1877. And then the seizures took a crazy twist. She started to suffer very severe seizures. Witnesses even said that she used to arch her back so much that she touched the heels of her feet with the back of her head. And these went on for weeks. Dr. Stevens, who was somebody who had heard the story through the Vennum's neighbours, paid their house a visit. He did not, however, meet Lurancy. Instead, the voice that came from the young girl claimed to be a German woman named Katrina Hogan, who was 63 and had passed some years before. She wasn't very pleasant to the Lurancy's family, hurling abuse at them every time she spoke. Then as quick as Katrina arrived, she was gone, and she was replaced by a young man by the name of Willie Cannon, who had died after running away from his family home. But then again, as soon as he arrived, he was gone also. Stevens then used mesmerism, or what we call today hypnosis, to calm Lurancy down, and the seizure stopped. She then, when woke, was able to tell everyone that there was evil spirits and they were trying to control her, and she was naturally very frightened. Dr. Stevens then suggests, perhaps you should go looking for a good spirit who could help you. Lurancy once again closed her eyes, and when she reopened them, she was smiling, as if all her pain and trauma was gone. However, it wasn't because Lurancy had become her old self again. It was because as the young girl looked around the room, she saw a face that she instantly recognized. And to the neighbour, Asa Roff, she said, "Hello, Father, it's me, Mary." Both the Roffs obviously were full of mixed emotions. They had just spent 12 years grieving over the loss of their daughter. Mr. Roff had visited all the mediums in the hope of getting some answers. He'd of course met some charlatans along the way. One of them had even handed him a note reputed to be from his daughter, but it of course wasn't. Mr. Roff raced home to tell his wife of the experience, whilst Dr. Stevens asked questions to establish that Lurancy was not playing tricks. And eventually Mary asked to go home, not where she was, but to the Roff's house. The Vennums obviously were very reluctant to do this, but after a week of her begging and pleading with them, they eventually relented, and Lurancy / Mary went to live at the Roff's home. She stayed with them for 15 weeks, and she knew all about friends of the Roffs and family members who lived away, who she'd never met, or who Lurancy had never met. But she also said Lurancy was very sick, and the seizures were a symptom of this illness. Then she was gone, and Lurancy was back, and she went home to the Vennums. After Mary had announced to the Roffs that Lurancy was ready to return, Mary walked across the street, and as she entered the Vennums' house, she left, and Lurancy was back. And as for long as she lived, Lurancy was never to suffer a seizure again. So as you can see, that's why it intrigued me, because how did somebody know so much about somebody who was actually born or actually died just before she was born? It is very, very strange. Now, it's called the Watseka Wonder. And as I say, you know, it obviously has a strange thing. So in 1878, the Stevens examined Vennum, and his account was published in the Leading Spiritualist Journal even. And in 1887, the book entitled The Watseka Wonder, in which he described Vennum as the most remarkable case of spirit return and manifestation ever recorded in history. According to Stevens, Vennum's character would change suddenly from morose and sullen to mystic and imaginary trances, in which he described joyous trips to heaven and visits with the angels. According to Stevens, Vennum often spoke in different voices and became several different people, including the old woman Katrina Hogan and the young man named Willie Cannon. Stephen claims she remembered the names of several people who had died and had possessed her body, and later chose to be possessed by the soul of Mary Roff. William James briefly mentioned the case in the book The Principle of Psychology in 1890. James commented that it is perhaps as extreme a case of possession of the modern sort as one can find. According to Stevens and Hodgins, Vennum allowed Mary Roff to possess her body for about 15 weeks, during which time she could allegedly recognise all of Roff's friends and relatives, as I mentioned, and was familiar with all the objects in the Roff home, and could retell incidents and stories from the Roff's childhood of her past life. Convinced that Vennum was a reincarnation of their daughter, the Roff family allowed the girl to live with them for several weeks. Stevens wrote that when Vennum later married, Roff's spirit supposedly inhabited Vennum, resulting in a painless childbirth for her. Upon reviewing the case, however, psychologist Frank Sargent Hoffman regarded Vennum as a typical case of hysterical impersonation and wrote that there was no evidence at all Vennum had knowledge she could not have obtained by normal means. Hoffman wrote that the grieving Roff family did everything in their power to encourage Vennum that she was in fact Mary. Journalist Henry Ann Bruce characterised Vennum as unduly suggestible, saying that it may be safely be declared that the phenomenon manifested through Lurancy Vennum were not a whit more otherworldly than the phenomenon produced by tricksters who Hodgson himself so skillfully and mercilessly exposed. Bruce wrote that recurrence of the Mary personality appeared only when the Roffs paid her visits, and that they ceased entirely upon her marriage to a man who was not interested in spiritualism, and her removal to a distant part of the country. And yet, we've just heard that Roff was meant to have come back and inhabit to German childbirth. There is an obscure syndicate radio program, Out of the Night, which dramatised the case. This still survived, even though it was made in 1949. DC Comics, believe it or not, their horror anthology House of Mystery, had a half-page filler titled Double Mourning that briefly recounted the alleged facts of the Lurancy Vennum case. A fictionalised play based on the case, Before I Wake, was produced and staged in 1986. It was written by William Westbrook, focusing on the Roffs, who mentioned it as being the writer's great-great-grandparents. The play was reviewed as a thriller by the New York Times. Writer Melissa Pritchard based her story Spirit Seizures on Lurancy Vennum. It is the title story in her collection Spirit Seizures, which won the Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction and was published in 1987. In 1996, a Lifetime movie network, Buried Secrets, told the story. In 2009, the film The Possessed, recounting the story of the Watseka case, was produced by the Booth brothers, Christopher St. Booth and Philip Adrian Booth, for the Sci-Fi Channel's Spook Television. Since then, the film has aired on the Channel Channel on June the 10th in 2012. Daniel Quinn used the event as the basis for the story of Mary Ann Dawson in the novel After Decor. And finally, in this year, on the Travel Channel series Ghost Brothers, Mary Roff's former house is investigated for her lingering spirit. So yeah, there's a few people who've, the critics who've come out and said it's possible, but reading it, it's one of those where, were the parents, as the critics saying, were the parents so desperate to hear from their daughter that they fed information to the daughter? Or did their daughter really possess this young woman? And as I say, it's a very difficult one to, to turn around and say that it was this or that. So when I read that story, I was very intrigued by it, simply because of the fact of, like I say, it could be one or it could be the other. It's very, very difficult to turn around and say it's definitely that or it's definitely the other. So yeah, very, very strange. But anyway, that brings us to the end of tonight's paranormal experience. Hope you've enjoyed it. I will be back next week with some more of the same, more interesting stories. Because as I say, I'm not here to debunk anything. I'm just here to offer an opinion. My opinion may not be right, but we'll just have to see. But yes, I'll be back with some more stories next week at 9 o'clock, and also some more cabinet curiosities. But until then, there's only one way to go out, and that's the way I always go out from a show, with this man. So until Sunday, when I'm back with the Paddy McGough Show, it's good night from me, and of course, it's good night from him.